Hi guys, we're going to continue with our study of Aristotle. This time we're going to look at Aristotle's discussion of friendship in books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. This is one of my favorite parts in Aristotle. I think it's really rich and really pretty directly pertinent to your everyday life, my everyday life. So we're going to look, as I said, at books 8 and 9. We're especially going to focus on two sections. I want to tell you what the real core of the reading is. And that's book 8, chapter 3, and book 9, chapter 4. All of this material is great. But I always find in studying a book, and also in teaching it, that the key is, in philosophy anyway, is to find where the big point is and focus on that right away, and then worry about the other stuff. So I tend to think in terms of concentric circles, like hit the bullseye first, and then go out to as many of the more peripheral things as you can. But so I would say work on those two chapters first. Each, as I say, chapters each a few pages long. We're going to start then in book 8, chapter 3. But before we get right into talking about the text, I want you to think a little bit about friendship. You know, in philosophy, I think, and probably in other areas too, I think the thing you always need to do if you want to understand the thing you're studying on is first to try to get the phenomenon itself into view, like to think about what your own relationship is to the thing, and then read what the relevant author has to say about it. So I want us to think a little bit about our own experience of friendship first before reading what Aristotle says about it. And so to do that, I want to get you to think about, I guess, two things. I want you to think back for a minute and try to think of a time in your life when a friendship was really important to you. Most people, I think, have at least one incident where they can say, yeah, having that friend there, that time really mattered. So I'd like you to try to think about that, sometime when friendship really mattered to you. The second thing I'd like you to think about is I'd like you to think about a person who you think of as a real friend, a really good friend to you. And that may be someone you used to know, or maybe someone you know now. But I'd like you to think about a particular person who's a really good friend to you. And I'd like you to think about, what that friendship means to you and why that person is a friend to you. So I think if you think about those two things first for a second, and just try to bring that material back to mind, then there's a pretty good chance you'll appreciate what Aristotle has to say. Anyway, so book 8, chapter 3. In book 8, chapter 3, Aristotle himself begins by doing something that's quite characteristic of him. He's very interested in what is called equivocity, and that means the way the same word is used to name different things. And so he's interested in that all over the place. He's interested in that here with friendship, because he says, yeah, there are a number of different things we call friends, but we don't mean quite the same thing in all those cases. So he's going to differentiate 3 different ways we use the term friend. 3 different things, 3 different relationships that we call friendship. It's important not to confuse one with the other, but it's especially important not to confuse 2 of them on one side with one of them on the other side, and that's what we're going to get to. So he says, but before I talk about friends, I want to just talk about that notion of equivocation or equivocity for a minute. It's very important to distinguish these situations where we use the same word in different ways, because sometimes we can fool other people or fool ourselves by doing that. Sometimes we can use the word in one way, in one part of what we're thinking or talking about, and then in another part just flip to another way. And when we do that, essentially, and deceive someone else, that's called the fallacy of equivocation. You'd study that in logic, actually. We can also do that to ourselves, though. We can think about things in one way here, and then without even noticing it, change what we mean by that notion over here. And the same way we might deceive someone by intentionally doing that in an argument or something, we can also sort of psychologically deceive ourselves by basically confusing 2 things that are actually different just because they have the same name. And that's pretty significant with this issue of friendship. So what are these 3 different ways we use that word? Well, he says, in this chapter you'll see, he says there are friendships of pleasure, friendships of utility, and friendships of virtue. And I want to talk now just about what those 2 mean. So he says, if we think about what again, I asked you to think about, really good friends, but I'd also like you to think now just more broadly about the people you think of as friends. And he says, if we think about what we mean when we call people friends, he says a lot of those friendships are what he calls friendships of pleasure. There's situations where we choose to spend time with another person because we get pleasure from spending time with them. It might be fun. Like you might go out with someone because whenever you go out with that person, it turns out you have a good time, right? And then he says there's another one. It's not quite the same, but it's related in a certain way. He says there's another one that's called friendships of utility. He says sometimes we have friends where we go out with them maybe not because we have a good time with them. You might not actually find them that interesting to spend time with, but by spending time with them, you get something good. Like it could be, like maybe a friendship of pleasure might be you just like to go out with a bar with this person because you always have a fun time. That person is fun at the bar, and you have a good time when you hang out with them. Good time friends. That'd be friendships of pleasure. But then there might be another person, and it's not such a good time to go out with that person. It's not awful, but it's not that great. But maybe that person is friends with the bartender at the bar you like. And so if that person comes with you, you always get free drinks at the bar or something like that. Right? That would be a friendship of utility. Someone that you hang out with because of something that comes from dealing with them. They get you something else you like, even though they're not that great. So first of all, there's a distinction there between friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility. There's a difference between them, but there's something also about those two that makes them similar to each other. And that is that in both of those cases, you're going out with that person not because you care about that person as such, but because of something you get from it. Right? And that's obvious in the case of the friendship of utility, right? You might not even like going out with that person that much, but if you go with them, you get something good. But friendships of pleasure can be a bit like that too, right? If that person, if you go out with one of those good time friends, and that person has been having a bad day, or that person has a lot of schoolwork or issue at their job that's getting them down or that they have to focus on, like, you don't want to hear about that. Like, the person, you go to the bar and that person wants to talk about, what a difficult day they had, and you think, what's this? This isn't what I want from you. I want to come out and have a good time, right? Or that person's, struggling with their parents or something like that. Like, you don't want to hear about that stuff. You want to go out and party. If you can imagine that situation, right? If you can imagine that situation where you would be sort of disappointed and frustrated with your interaction, not find it desirable, if you had to deal with in your interaction the issues that person is grappling with in their psychological life, then you realize that person's psychological life isn't what you're interested in, right? You're interested in the good time that comes from hanging out with them. You're not interested in them. Right? So friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility, which probably for most people make up a lot of the things they call friendship, are like, even though they're different from each other, they're like each other because neither one of them is really about caring about the other person. Each of them is really about caring about something you like that you get from that relationship. And so Aristotle says, this is in Book 8, Chapter 3, he says, this is at 1156a, probably around line 18 or so, he says, these then are friendships incidentally. For it's not for being what he is that the person that you like is being liked, but insofar as that person provides something or gives pleasure. Right? So they're friendships only incidentally. In both of those cases, the other person isn't really what the relationship is about. It's about you and what you get from it. So friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility are about you and about satisfying something that you want. But they're not about the good of that other person. The other person isn't the end or the goal of the relationship. The other person is a means. And the goal or the end of that relationship is something desirable that you get. So as I said, friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility are different from each other in exactly how you're getting something from another person, but they're the same in that in both of those cases, that other person is really a means to a different end, and that end is both basically about you and satisfying something you want. So we're going to distinguish that from something else now in a moment, which is what he calls friendships of virtue, and that's where you actually care about the other person as such. But before jumping to that, again, I'd just like you to think about this. I'd like you to think about the things you call friendships, and think about whether you can say, yeah, the thing I call a friendship with that person is really an example of that thing. I'm really going out with that person just because they bring me a good time or I get something from it. And that, that could already be a little bit uncomfortable because you might not want to admit about some of your relationships that that's why you're doing it. But then have another thought, and this one might even be a little more uncomfortable. You might think about some of the other friendships you have where someone calls you a friend. And you might ask yourself, is that other for that other person, am I just a friend of pleasure? Am I just a friend of utility? Why does that other person like me as a friend? So you might think about those things. Anyway, now let's think about the other thing he says, and this is what is true friendship. He calls this friendship of virtue. And he says, in a friendship of virtue, on the contrary, that's what we mean by a real friend, by which we mean someone who actually cares about you. And that means in that friendship, the other person, that you matter to the other person, and the other person matters to you. And each of you actually cares about the good of the other person. And that's why he calls it friendship of virtue. Remember, we talked about virtue last time. And virtue meant, developing yourself to a good state, right? To a state of health, not organic health, although that might be relevant too, but psychological health, right? Or what we could even call existential health, to use the language of 20th century philosophy. The virtue was really about bringing your humanity to its healthy flourishing. And so to the extent that a true friend really cares about your good, that means they're really caring about that. They're helping, they're oriented towards wanting you to be able to flourish as a person, as a human being. And in that sense, virtue is kind of what that friendship is ultimately about, like caring for the other's good, caring for each other's good. So he says, friendships of virtue, that's really what friendship is. And so, I was using this language of equivocation or equivocity before. So he would say, the real meaning of friendship is this. You care for each other. And those other things, friendships of pleasure and friendships of virtue, we call them friendship. But they're almost like imposters. So he could say, that's friendship equivocally so called, right? We call them friends, but it's pretty important that you recognize that what you mean when you call those other people friends is not the same as what you mean when you call a true friend a friend. Indeed, they're basically opposites, because in true friendship, you care about that other person. That means the person is the goal or the end. In those other ones, the person is a means. It's not an end. You're not being cared for. You're being used in those other relationships. Whereas here, you're basically being cultivated and protected. Right? So the difference between these is pretty serious. And so, if you go back again and think of that first question I asked you, when I thought, when was a friendship really important to you? And do you have a friend that you think of as a really good friend? I would hope that turns out to be a version of this. Someone where you really feel like in that relationship with the other person, I actually cared about that person, and that person actually cared about me. So I'd like you. So that's the first really big point. Then is to sort of meditate a bit on this really big difference between true friendship of virtue, or what he also calls complete or perfect friendship, and then these other things that are kind of we call them friendship, but they're actually, they mean something really quite different. They're instrumental relationships to another person, where we are happy to associate that person, not because of who that person is, but because of something we get from it. So again, just to say this central point one more time, but in different words, in friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility, my interests are what are served by a friendship with you. But in friendships of virtue, your interests are actually what I care about. Right? So let's talk a little bit more now about those friendships of virtue. Well, actually, let me say one more thing first before I do that. About the difference. Just something to emphasize how palpable that difference is. And I would hope that you would say, oh yeah, right, I see that. One of the things he says in Book 9, Chapter 3, I'll just skip ahead to that, is that you feel that difference when you thought the friendship was about one thing, and it turns out to be about another. So he says, but someone could level an accusation if another who was fond of him on account of utility or pleasure was pretending to be fond of him on account of his character. And he says, because real differences between friends show up when you and the other person aren't operating on the same interpretation of what kind of friendship it is. I bet there are lots of friendships of utility where you go out with that person because you're getting something from them, but you don't really like hanging out with them that much. But probably the friend that you're hanging out with doesn't have that interpretation of the relationship. You probably don't want to think that person probably doesn't want to think, oh, X is going out with me only because I get them free drinks at the bar. You want to think, oh, the person likes hanging out with me. You might still think it's because you give them pleasure, or you might think it's for some deeper reason. But the thing is, if you discovered that it was only of utility, you might not like that. And consequently, when people have friendships of utility, often they conceal that fact, right? And indeed, maybe friendships of pleasure too. It's pretty easy to try to convince, or let me say this: it's pretty common, I think, for people who want a certain kind of pleasure or utility from another person to try to present themselves to that person as if they actually cared about them. They don't really care about them. But they present that so that they get that pleasure or that utility. So as I said, if you want to think about the difference between those two things and see the force of that idea, that you don't want to confuse these two things with real friendship, that they're actually in a way kind of opposite. Because these ones are about treating a person as a means. These are instrumental relationships, whereas this is actually intrinsically caring about the good of the person, a moral relationship, or a relationship of virtue. Just think about that situation of what it's like to find out that friendship you have wasn't the kind you thought it was, or again, from the other side, ask yourself why it is that people conceal their intentions in those cases. Right in there, I can think you can see some of the differences. But so now let's think about those friendships of virtue for a minute. One thing about those friendships of virtue is that, when I asked you, do you have a good best friend or something, and I said, most people have some experience like that. Most people don't have hundreds of those things. You don't have tons of really great friendships all over the place, because it's a little bit hard to find people that really care about you. Well, people who are willing to care about you and able to. And, people who really care about you is not just a matter of a flip of a switch in the mind. We say, oh, I really care about you, right? Caring for another person it takes time and effort. You have to learn something about who that other person is, and you have to become able to care for them by spending time with them, and so on. In fact, Aristotle says that. He says that in Book 8, Chapter 3, at the end of it. He says, this is around 1156b 25. Yet friendships of this sort are likely to be rare, since people of that sort, who are going to care for each other, are few. And he says, further, there is also need of the passage of time and the habits formed from living together. And he says that same thing again then in Chapter 6. He says at 1158a, around 14, also one must acquire experience of the other person and be in the habit of living together, which is difficult. So to develop good friendships, you actually have to have found someone that is going to turn out to be the right match, and you have to spend time with them, and not just it's not just a matter of the quantitative passage of time on a clock. It's quality time, right? It's actually spending time with that other person, where the passage of time is the process of you and that other person becoming more sort of connected and more integrated. And that's, as he says, developing the habits formed by living together, by spending time together, right? And so you can't have a friend of virtue in 5 minutes. You might meet someone. It's kind of like love at first sight. Like, you might meet someone and think, oh, I bet we're going to be great friends. And you might be right about that. But the friendship doesn't come in that moment, right? The hope for it might come in that moment. And you might or might not turn out to be right about it. But if you're going to become friends, it's actually going to take time to learn how to be together. And so that's the line he ends Book 8, Chapter 3 with. He says, "For a wish for friendship arises swiftly, but friendship itself does not." So that's the first big point. I'm going to go on and say something further, but that's the first big point that I wanted us to get through, was that idea that there are these different kinds of friendship, but it's not just like different kinds, like there's an oak tree, there's a maple tree, there's a birch tree, like they're just interestingly different ones. They're different in a powerful way, that there's a difference between what real friendship is and what other things are that we use the same word for, but that are almost opposite in their significance. And so I wanted you to think about those things and think about what's at stake in those kinds of relationships and so on. And then just to reiterate this last point, right? True friends take time, and it's a matter of getting involved with each other. And that also, maybe I could say one more little thing about that. That also may be why, you probably really true friends like that start to become a meaningful thing in a person's life, probably only at a certain age. Maybe in teenage years, and especially in young adult life or later adult life, your life becomes, maybe especially in teenage years, your life starts to become pretty rich and full. You start sort of breaking away from the family and developing an individual life, and you have issues and things are complicated. And that's when connecting with people who actually care about you really matters, and so on. Whereas when you're younger, when you're a kid, probably friendships of pleasure are largely what things are about. Like, this is not universally true, of course, but in a significant way, that your deeper emotional life is probably, as a child, largely worked out by the love and care you get from your parents and your siblings and so on. That's probably where and something like friendship of virtue is happening. But associated with other people is largely about finding ways to have a good time and so on. And the childish interactions with other people probably don't tend to get that deep. And so there's not that much that friendship can be beyond having a good time together, right? So for the young, friendships of pleasure, that's probably largely what friendship means. And the idea that friendship is really a matter of virtue or caring for the good of another person, that's probably an understanding of friendship that itself comes with maturing, comes with growing up. So you probably don't even grasp that that's what friendship could or should be until you yourself grow out of a kind of childish perception of things to a significant degree. And so I think friendship in that sense, probably for most of us, really starts to become a meaningful issue in maybe our teen years and then in our younger adult years. I just wanted to add that point because he talks about this a bit in that first chapter, that idea that different kinds of friendship are really relevant to people at different stages of their development. So friendships of virtue, I think, in a significant way, are kind of an adult thing. They're part of maturity. They are themselves part of virtue. They're part of growing up into your deeper humanity. Anyway, so that was the first point. Now I want to move on to the second point about this, and it's looking more deeply at this significance of friendships of virtue. And here the issue is, again, like, what do you get out of these friends? Well, we already put a name to it, pleasure, utility, or virtue, or so on. But I want to put that a little differently, I guess. What's going on when you get involved in those friendships, and what might be the deeper issues for seeking these kinds of friendships? What role do they play in our lives? And here I want to focus on the second really powerful reading, which is Book 9, Chapter 4. And the basic thing he says here, he's talking about a good person. What's, if you're a virtuous person, if you're a person who has worked at, trying to be good, he says then this is at 1166a, about line 13. In our translation, it's on page 194. He says, "For this decent person is of like mind with himself, and longs for the same things with his whole soul." I'm just pulling that sentence out of context for you and reading it to you, but here's basically what he means. He means that, when you're trying to be a good person, you're really working at something, and you kind of stand behind what you're doing. And in that sense, you might you might do a better or worse job at it, but you can look at yourself and basically kind of feel good about that, in the sense that you can say, yeah, I'm working at this, I'm trying to do it, and you can basically take a certain pride in what you're trying to be, who you're trying to be. You can basically have a good kind of sense about yourself. But he's saying that's kind of the opposite for the person who is not trying to be a good person. He says people who aren't doing so well at that, at being a good person, there's sort of less extremes and more extreme versions of this. Like the less extreme version is like, yeah, you kind of want to be good, but you have such bad habits that you keep doing things that aren't so good. Or the more extreme thing is you're not even trying to be good, right? And he says, if you're in those situations, if you behave badly, or if you don't even want to be good, in those situations, you can't so easily look at yourself and think, oh yeah, I'm happy with this. And so he says, for a decent person, existence is itself a good thing. You like living. In fact, and he says a similar kind of thing. Let me just skip ahead a little bit. Book 9, Chapter 7. He says, people are fond of their own work, and he says, artists make things, and they like the things they make, and so on. And he says, this is at 1168a, about line 7. "We exist by means of activity," which is, the choices we make, the life we live, and so on. And in that sense, in your activity, it's kind of like you're making a work, just the way an artist might make a work. And that's what you can feel good about. You can feel good about those choices you made. Well, so go back to this thing from Book 9, Chapter 4. The good person is through a decent person, through his or her, their choices, is sort of making their life something. And if your choices are built around you trying to be good and carrying out good habits, well, then you're going to be happy with that thing you're making. But if you're always making choices that you actually don't think are the good ones, like if you sort of think, yeah, this would be good, but I just have such bad habits, I'm always doing the wrong thing, or if you aren't even trying to do good things, you can't easily look at that life you're making and say, oh, I'm proud of that thing I have constructed. Right, so I want you to look at those things from Book 9, Chapter 4 and Book 9, Chapter 7 to think about that issue of how in our choices we kind of make ourselves something, and then we can have an attitude about that thing we've made ourselves. And one of the things about being a good person is you can look at that and feel good about it. If you're not exactly a decent person, it's hard to feel that way about yourselves, right? And so that's where the issue of friends comes in. So he says, why do good people want friends? Good people want good friends because those people will share with them in their existence and support them in their projects and so on. And that's kind of a sort of mutually happy thing. Why do base people, not decent people, corrupted people who haven't cared for virtue, why do they want friends? They want friends so they don't have to look at themselves. They want friends to flee from themselves. They want friends to flee from that critical perspective they could take on themselves and see a problem. So for bad people, the goal is to have friends who will distract them from a moral self-perception. Whereas for good people, it's great to have friends who stand up for a moral point of view, because that's the point of view you're trying to stand up for yourself, right? Let me read you this one line from Book 9, Chapter 4. I think this is a really powerful line and really rich and worth thinking about. This is 1166 B, around 14. He says, "Corrupt people seek to pass their days with others, but they flee themselves, because when by themselves they are reminded of many odious things and anticipate still others." So he's saying, for corrupt people, friends, maybe friendships of pleasure would be a really big one. Friends are a kind of distraction, a kind of entertainment. They're a way to put yourself on something other than yourself. Whereas for good people, the other person cares about you, and so in that sense, your own nature is part of what the friendship is about, and that's a great thing, because you don't have a need to flee yourself. You're not trying to hide. I could end the sentence there. You're not trying to hide. There's nothing really there that you're trying to hide from. And so I want to read one more line about that. Well, actually, I want to read two more. I want to quickly go back to Book 8, Chapter 8. And there he basically says, this would be around 1159 B, well, I guess where B starts. He talks about these different kind of friendships. And the basic thing he says there is that good friends don't let you err. Like they stand up for the person you're trying to be. And so for a good person, a good friend is a real support in their own efforts to become a good person. Whereas immoral friends, as he says, delight in each other's corruption. That's at 1159b, around line 9. For people who are themselves immoral, you go out with other immoral friends to kind of get, again, to hide from that moral perspective and to try to get validation in your activities of self-corruption. Anyway, I said I wanted to say two things. So that's the one about the difference between how good friends support each other versus how bad friends corrupt each other. And I want to say one other thing, and this is from Book 9, Chapter 8. In our translation, that's on around page 200. That's on page 200. And this is, but it's around 1168b 5 or so, 5 or 6. I guess 6. He says, it's important to remember that all that characterizes friendship stems from oneself and extends towards the others. So the point I want to make there is just this. Right? We were talking about what you can get from a good friend or from a bad friend and so on. But the point is also this. Who you are really shapes what you can give to a friendship. Right? So I wanted you to try to put those two things together, right? And to see how Aristotle is trying to show you that friendship is inseparable from these issues of basically character development that we talked about from books 1 and 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, both in the sense that the development of our character really pretty much depends on how we develop those friendships, but also the kinds of friendships we are able to have really depends on the way we develop our own character. And then I want to just conclude with the where this ends. So in Book 9, Chapter 12, he says at the very end, basically in summary, it's 1172a, around line 9. The friendship of base people is corrupt. They share in base things, and being unsteady or not really consistent people themselves, they come to corrupt by becoming like one another. But the friendship of decent people is decent and is increased by their associating with each other. So so I just want to add that point then to the point I was really making at the beginning. So the first big point I was making was distinguishing these instrumental relationships that we call friendships, friendships of pleasure and utility, from this caring relationship that is the friendship of virtue. That was the point I was making in the first part, based primarily around Book 8, Chapter 3. Another point in the second part that I'm making, based primarily around Book 9, Chapter 4, is that is something more about that first part was kind of the static types of friendship. This is kind of more like the interpersonal and psychological dynamics of friendship. And here the point was that the function those friendships play in our own development is that basically trying to be a good person goes together with trying to develop good friendships, and those things are mutually supportive. Kind of being a bad person goes together with developing bad friendships, and those things are kind of mutually destructive. And it seems to me you can think about yourself and the relationships you're in and the relationships your friends are in, both in light of both these things. And they're two sides of the same coin. But you can look at that first part and ask, what kind of friendship is this? And then you can also ask, what's happening through having this kind of friendship? And as I said, you can see all of this is really intimately connected to that core question Aristotle was asking in books 1 and 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, about how what it takes for us to develop as persons, to become happy persons, and to flourish in our distinctive humanity. So we're going to leave our study there, but we're going to come back now and we're going to come back to a little bit of a study of Plato, and kind of pick up on some pretty similar kinds of themes next time.